Hero Time, Chapter 22, Not So Helpful. The next 24 hours were calm, thank God, but then Kevin got kidnapped by a Kinesillaran and a Tetramand. It took them some time, and Jen illegally driving her motorcycle, to find him. It was that, or take the bus. But when they did find the two alien teens, Jen was a bit surprised at how resourceful they were at fighting, for people who clearly had no concept of what a Flummer's kid was. But she didn't have long to admire their fighting spirit as masonry rained, smacking her in the head, sending her spinning into darkness. When she woke up, everything was fuzzy and there was blood dripping down her face. Fuck. She blinked, the sound of the fight going on around her echoing in her head. She struggled to her feet and spun the dial on the Omnitrix, trying to focus on which alien she was looking at. It was exceedingly difficult. She didn't even realize that her feet were still moving until she was almost crushed as part of a building fell from Kevin fighting the Tetramand. When had Kevin shown back up? Weren't they here to save him? She blinked as Kevin said something that she didn't quite process. She stepped back and blinked again, finally able to focus on the alien showing on the Omnitrix. Swampfire. Swampfire was good. Yeah, she thought she heard Kevin call out, but she wasn't sure if it was directed at her, though it may have been, as suddenly both of her hands were caught in what looked like the kind of tethers dog catchers used, but more high-tech. She struggled to slap the Omnitrix as she screamed, feeling her feet leave the ground. One of the tethers came loose, and Jen screamed again as she was dragged into the null void projector. For an instant, the tether caught, and Jen slapped the Omnitrix, transforming just in time to slap a vine to the projector as the tether snapped. For one heart-stopping moment, she dangled between Earth and the null void as her head cleared. Kevin closed his eyes as Jen disappeared through the portal to the null void. He hadn't wanted this. He'd talked about what he would do to get revenge on Jen throughout his time in the null void, but she wasn't going to make it there, and there was no way to get her back. Gwen screamed, and for an instant everything flashed pink. Kevin blinked and found the Kinesillaran hanging upside down by her ankles, and the Tetramand was tied up but struggling. "What did you just do to my cousin?" Gwen's voice was doubled, and Kevin blinked at her as the Kinesillaran screamed, the pink tightening around her ankles and spreading like vines down her body. The Tetramand snarled. "It might be a museum piece, but it worked on your friend." He snarked and cried out in pain as the pink energy spread and tightened around him, too. Kevin grabbed Gwen by the shoulder. "This isn't going to bring her back, Gwen. There's nothing anyone can do. She's trapped in the null void, but at least she's alive. These idiots thought that was a disintegrator." Gwen did not look mollified in the slightest. She was shaking with rage. Then a hand emerged from the red portal, still active behind the generator. Kevin stared as Swampfire pulled herself out of the portal and yanked a vine out of the edge of it. That had been the only thing connecting Jen to Earth, and it was a miracle she'd managed it. He shook his head. "Never underestimate the Tennyson." The Tetramand roared in frustration as Gwen's face changed from an anger that scared even Kevin to relief. With Gwen's concentration broken, it was much easier to break the energy bindings around the four-armed teen. He drew his guns and fired on Swampfire, who took each shot without even flinching, the holes left behind healing over in seconds. "You done?" Without waiting for an answer, Jen blasted the Tetramand until he stayed down. The Kinesillaran stared from her spot, still trapped by Gwen's mana. "Now, if you'll just take 5 minutes to let us explain what's actually happening here, maybe we can work something out." Kevin frowned. He wasn't feeling very generous towards these two kids, but Jen was ever the hero and explained the situation. Once for the Kinesillaran, Helen, and once for the Tetramand, Manny, once he had come around. It seemed like they had been at this for a while, tossing aliens into the null void without a care for what the circumstances were. They wanted to make up for it, too, by rescuing those that didn't belong, that they had sent there. Swampfire shook her head as the two Plumbers kids disappeared through the null void projector. "That will not go well," Kevin said, shaking his head. "I don't know. On paper, we don't look like such a good team either." Kevin nodded. "Why haven't you turned back?" Gwen asked as Jen stepped away from the truck the null void projector seemed attached to. "I'm waiting for Swampfire to heal my concussion." She reached up and brushed aside a few of the large yellow flower petals that served as Swampfire's hair. There was a thin line of green slowly seeping from a cut there. It was rapidly healing, as all of Swampfire's injuries did, but Gwen still frowned. That doesn't look good, Jen shrugged. Not really, hence the waiting until I either time out or heal. I can't drive home with a concussion. Kevin frowned as they made their way back towards the warehouse Helen and Manny had been using as a base. You don't have a license. Jen nodded. It's never stopped me before. She gestured to where her bike was still parked. There was some rubble on the ground around it, but the bike itself was clear. You know, in another life, you'd have made a fantastic criminal, Tennyson. Jen laughed as the Omnitrix flashed red and she turned back into herself, the wound on her head now a tiny pink scar covered by her hair. Gwen shook her head at her cousin. You're not driving. You can't drive a bike. I'm driving. We do only have room for two on the bike, though. She glanced at Kevin. I'll be fine. I'm gonna go swipe some of their equipment, though. Jen shook her head. No, you're not. Because I need you to drive the truck back to the hole. No telling when we might need a null void projector, even an antique. Kevin nodded. Fair enough, but I'll be back. Jen rolled her eyes and pulled her helmet on, handing Gwen the spare. I expect nothing less, she said as she mounted the bike, and Gwen mounted behind her. The girls drove off, and Kevin smiled as he began to whistle and make his way into the warehouse. Chapter 23, Incursion. Jen sat in the back seat of Kevin's car, Al sitting next to her, his hand in hers. Come on, Gwen. Come on, Gwen. We've done the lake a few times. The auto show's only in town for a few more days. Kevin nodded. Auto show it is. Gwen glared at the teen. Come on, Al, what do you say? I'm not familiar with Earth combustion technology. On my planet, we use mostly hover mechanics that are powered by the solar radiation that comes from our sun. Gwen rolled her eyes, but Jen grinned. Oh, nice. I had a hoverboard when I was a kid. It was awesome. A bounty hunter called Tetrax gave it to me. Kevin laughed. Only you could say that sentence like it's a normal thing to say. They all blinked as bright white light shone outside. Suddenly, from beside the car, Jen's hand tightened on Al's as she spotted the face of a frog-like creature standing outside Kevin's car. Surrender or be destroyed, one of the creatures called out, and Jen heard them power up their weapons. Don't take off your ID mask. I have an idea. She whispered it so quietly that only Al heard it. Okay, we surrender. Just don't hurt the car. Kevin turned off the engine and slowly stepped out of the car. He stood with his hands up, but he was close enough to the car that if he reached out, he would be covered in the metal in moments. Jen nodded to Al, who looked terrified. Gwen was next out of the car. She stood close to Kevin, but out of touch range, her hands also raised. Al stepped out next, following their lead. He hoped Jen had a plan. Jen was the last out of the car, her hands also raised, but much closer to the back of her head. It would only take an instant to activate the Omnitrix. She must have spun the dial while they were all getting out of the car. He hoped she'd picked a good alien for this fight. Kevin? She questioned. He nodded, making no move to reach for his car. Incursion warriors packing heavy ordnance. Jen's fingers twitched towards the Omnitrix. Another flash of light nearly blinded them, and there was another figure standing among the incursions. He was tall, taller than Jen by at least a foot, maybe more, and his brain was exposed, though he wore some kind of dome over it. He shook his head and spoke to the incursions. Weapons down. Sorry, Kevin. You know incursions. Kevin grinned, his stance relaxing in an instant. He stepped forward and shook hands with the new arrival. Raph, it's good to see you, man. Gwen and Jen relaxed slowly, Al following their lead as the incursions stowed their weapons. They weren't here for him. Kevin led Raph over to Gwen. Raph, this is Gwen Tennyson. The incursions began to mutter to themselves. Al caught the last name again, along with a few of Jen's more well-known titles. Wielder of the Omnitrix, Azimuth's Chosen, and Defeater of Vilgax among them. Raph raised a metallic eyebrow. His whole face seemed to be made of metal. Tennyson. He made no move to shake Gwen's hand, simply nodding in her direction. Kevin nodded. Yeah, that's her there. He pointed at Jen, who waved with the hand the Omnitrix rested on. Al couldn't help but think she did that on purpose as the incursions pulled back looking highly intimidated. The slight smirk on Jen's face was something he hadn't seen before. Kevin shrugged as Raph actually bowed slightly. Al glared at him. I used to talk about what I'd do to you. Yeah, back when you were a crook. Kevin shrugged at Jen's words. Hey, I did good work. Not always honest, but good. Jen let out a short laugh. There was a glimmer in her eyes Al hadn't seen before, a kind of intensity that came with adrenaline and battle instincts honed over years of people trying to kill her. Raph nodded. Never expected to see you two working together, but it may work in our benefit tonight. I need your help. Jen rolled her eyes and sat down on the hood of Kevin's car. Never expected to be working with him. What do you need help with? She questioned as Al stepped over to her. Raph raised his eyebrow a bit as he looked Al up and down. Kevin nodded. Oh yeah, this is Al Apollo. He's a plumber's kid. Raph nodded and turned back to Kevin and Jen, all his focus leaving Al, who would have breathed a sigh of relief if he had thought it was safe to do so. 7-7 snatched a little girl in this sector, and I need to find her fast. She wore the royal colors. He held up a scrap of purple cloth. Don't suppose you've seen anyone like that. Kevin and Jen shrugged. Wait, 7-7? No relation to 6-6, is there? Raph nodded. He's the same race as 6-6, but he's more dangerous. Jen nodded. We'll help you. Why should we? He's really more of a work friend. Then Kevin's radio came to life with an ultimatum from the Emperor of the Incursions. Okay, where do we start? Jen stood from her spot on the hood of the car. There's going to be a panic. Earth doesn't get death threats every day. Kevin shook his head. Normal Earth radios don't pick up faster than light transmissions. Jen nodded. Good point, but we're not the only ones who can pick that kind of thing up. She grabbed Al's hand and pulled him to the back of the car. Gwen should be able to track the princess from the scrap of cloth Raph's got, assuming it was hers. Raph nodded and handed the fabric to Gwen. I need to make a phone call to stop some of our other teammates from panicking. Give me a minute. She dragged Al with her to the other side of the Mr. Smoothies building. Call Varaxi. Tell her not to panic. You may be getting dragged into this, but keep your ID mask on and we shouldn't have a problem. They don't seem to even know you're here. I'll get you out of this, I promise. Al nodded and took the phone she offered. She kept a lookout while he made the call. Varaxi had indeed been panicking, but calmed when she heard that he was with Jen. If anyone could protect him from the incursions, it was her. She would be standing by for orders should she be needed, though. Jen had no idea what alien to use as the dam split, sending Gwen hurtling away in a large wash of water. So why not try the one she hadn't tried yet? It didn't look like anything impressive on the watch, but she had a feeling it would be more impressive than its simple outline. She slapped her hand onto the watch and felt power flood into her. She barely caught a glimpse of the stars flooding her skin as she seemed to slip into the mind of this alien, but it wasn't scary like it had been with Ghost Freak. This was a comforting feeling. No matter what happened to this alien, she was safe. Alien X. The name popped into her head in two voices as she thought about fixing the dam, stopping the water, and saving the people around her. Seconded. Water-stopping motion passes. The voices seemed to echo around her and from her. One of them was hers, but the other two were unfamiliar. She blinked as she landed in front of two gigantic masks. One had more feminine features. The other was twisted in anger. Oh, good. It's so good to have another woman to talk to. The first mask spoke, smiling down at her. Her voice was high, feminine, and sweet. Jen looked around, very confused. She was hovering in a starscape. Nothing but the masks in front of her could be seen. Stars twinkled in the distance, but none close enough to see where she was. It's about time you got here. The second mask sounded male, with a deep voice. It had an irritated tone to it, and he seemed upset at her for some reason. Wait, what? Kevin was impressed as they all landed unharmed next to Jen. She stood nearly a foot taller than she usually did. This alien looked like someone had taken a piece of space and shaped it into a female. Like Jen herself, she wasn't overly curvy, years of training holding muscle definition, But the only thing that defined this alien was the stars twinkling in her skin, the short crop of hair flowing around its head, and the 3 horns protruding from the middle and sides of its forehead. He brushed some water off himself and stood. Kick-ass. Has she ever used this alien before? Gwen shook her head, twisting water out of her hair. No, but with power like this one's gotta be the go-to from now on. Gwen might have been right, too, but something was wrong. 7-7 flew by, snatching up Atea. Jen just stood there, unmoving. It was then that Kevin noticed the obvious. She hadn't moved, spoken, or even seemed to breathe since stopping the dam from being destroyed in the first place. Gwen shook Jen's shoulder. Nothing. Al stepped up to her. Jen? No response. She didn't even blink. Pure green eyes staying open and staring. Does this happen often? The Apollinite sounded like he was trying to hold back panic. Kevin didn't blame him. Gwen shook her head. No, something's wrong. The last place in the universe Al wanted to end up was on board the Royal Incursion ship, in front of the Emperor himself. What was worse was there was some kind of energy field that disrupted his ID mask, shocking him and forcing him to pull it off or lose an eye. Of course, the minute he did that, the Emperor ordered his arrest. Jen still wasn't moving. She was sticking out of the back of the trunk of Kevin's car. Kevin and Gwen were a hell of a team to see fighting together, even if they almost forgot Jen in the trunk of the car, still unmoving, statue-like. But they got caught in the end. Raph had vanished, taking with them their one escape route from the ship. The Emperor paid the ransom for his daughter, but hadn't expected her to double-cross him. Atea looked them up and down. These 2 tried to save me. I'll spare them. Once I destroy their planet, they'll be the rarest specimens in my zoo! She turned to Jen, still statue cut from the stars. She circled the statue. Al glared at her as she nodded. This thing was formidable once, and nearly pretty. Have it put in a dungeon after we blow up Earth. And you, she turned to Al, a large grin on her face, you're one of the princes of Apollo 1 we've been looking for. What stroke of luck! Your execution will be public, in front of your people, as a show of force. Atea giggled. Bring him with the statue thing. He can watch me blow up Earth. See what'll become of his planet if they resist. 7-7 picked up Jen, still unresponsive, and Al felt tears rise in his throat. He was jabbed in the back with a gun and followed the procession back to the throne room. He was placed inside a cage with Jen. He couldn't help but watch as Atea gloated and preened on the throne. Gwen and Kevin stood off to the side. Both had guns pointed at them. He turned away from the incursion, and to Jen, still a statue cut from the stars. Please, I need your help, now more than ever. He reached out and cupped her face. She was still warm. He could feel the life inside her. It was bright, almost as if more than one life. There was more than one life in this body. He laid his forehead on hers. Please, he begged. This form of hers had no mouth, no nose, only the eyes staring out beyond him as if they saw something he could never comprehend. He was going to die. He felt tears slide down his face. If he was going to die, there was one thing he wanted to do first. He framed Jen's star-strewn face in both hands and pressed a gentle kiss to her lips, or at least where they should have been. Jen felt a light pressure on her mouth as she opened it to continue arguing with Serena and Bellicus. She glanced over her shoulder at the floating image that was showing her what was happening back in the real world. Right at that moment, all it showed was Albraxix. Jen blushed as she realized what he was doing. He was kissing her. She blinked again as a familiar voice echoed in her head. New DNA sample acquired. The voice vanished as soon as it appeared. Jen shook her head and turned back to the floating masks. Anger rose in her. They were still arguing about dinosaurs. Both went silent as she spoke, though. You're supposed to be love and compassion. How can you let 2 worlds die? And you're supposed to be anger and aggression. How can you let her get away with this? How can you let evil like this go unpunished? How can both of you be so useless? Bellicus growled at her. Useless? We are the most powerful being in the universe. We can change the very nature of space and time. Serena sounded like she was trying to calm Jen down, but the human had had enough. And yet you do nothing. Billions upon billions of lives at stake, but not one, but two worlds threatened with annihilation, and you're both hung up on procedure. Jen shouted it loudly and glared at both of the masks as Serena began to cry. There were no real tears, but she whimpered and sobbed as if she were crying. Bellicus scowled. Now look what you've done. Fine. I move we save the Earth. Happy now? Jen glared at him. No. He looked slightly taken aback. Just let me out of here. I have 9 other aliens who can do your jobs better than you. Serena whimpered again. That's hurtful. She sobbed and Jen glared at her. Hurtful it might be, but only because it's true. Al closed his eyes as Atea reached for the button sitting on the arm of a throne. Gwen hid her face in Kevin's shirt. She couldn't watch her world burn. She couldn't watch her cousin turned into some kind of living trophy. She felt a sob rise in her throat. Then there was a familiar flash of green light. She shot up from her spot in Kevin's arms as the bars on the cell holding them melted under Swampfire's fire. Blowing up worlds is for big kids only. Gwen had never been more relieved to hear Jen make a wisecrack before. Al was next to leap into action. An arrow made of bright violet energy slammed into 7-7's armor, and the bounty hunter cried out in pain. Kevin raised an eyebrow as he slapped a hand to the floor, absorbing the metal while Gwen gave him cover. Didn't know you could do that. I do not like causing violence and pain. I am a healer, but I will not stand by while worlds are threatened. I could not have risked it in the cage. There might have been a field around it. I could have killed either of us. Gwen nodded. Smart. Give me the button. The words caught all of their attention. Jen was glaring at Atea, who was holding her nose. Apparently, Swampfire's methane odor did not sit well with incursions. Who's gonna make me? Game's over, sweetheart. The Emperor was back on his throne. Gwen snatched the trigger for the conquest ray from him. Kevin shook his head. Nope, we're done. Gwen frowned. For your assistance in uncovering my daughter's treachery, I will spare your worlds. He tapped a button on the throne. Tell the troops on Apollo 1 to pull back. We'll leave them be. Albrassix let out a short, surprised breath as the incursion on the other side of the call gave an affirmative response. Gwen handed the button back, reluctantly, but the Emperor smiled at them as Atea struggled under the hold of her guards. I'll get you back for this! Jen turned back into herself with a flash of light. Atea looked her up and down. You're kind of cute for a mammal. The Emperor shook his head. Put her in stasis with her mother. The guards nodded and carried Atea off. The Emperor nodded to them, and in a flash of light they were all back in the Mr. Smoothie's parking lot. Kevin's car joined them a moment later, and Kevin let out a breath. Jen waited a few moments before she sagged with relief. She looked exhausted and stumbled slightly. Al caught her. She looked a little punch-drunk. Sorry, I'm very tired. Within seconds, she was asleep in his arms. Gwen raced over to them as Al scooped Jen up into his arms. Kevin was hot on her heels. My place is closest. Come on. They piled into the car and took off at a breakneck pace.